Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. As I said, I'm Mark McCombs. I'm the Executive Director of Kolbe House, the Jail and Prison Ministry for the Archdiocese of Chicago. I'm a member also of the Advocacy Network team. I'm going to introduce my co-presenter and our main presenter, Percy Glover, in just a minute. But if we could just take a minute to pray together, we can set on ourselves, go into our own hearts, find our presence of God for a second here. And Lord, as the election approaches, we pray for the election of officials who best understand the needs of the men and women and young people we serve and their families. We pray for both those officials and us to have eyes that are free from blindness, so that all will see the incarcerated and the returning resident as brother and sister, deserving of full and equal dignity. And with that, we pray that both those officials and us have the strength to guarantee for our incarcerated and returning resident brothers and sisters the full and equal promise of the very best our country has to offer. We ask this in the name of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, through the intercession of his Blessed Mother, and in a very special way for those of us in Chicago, the intercession of our patron, St. Maximilian Kolbe. And to that we say, Amen. Move on and introduce Percy Glover. Percy just told me that he is uh, uh, a man of my own heart. He is in a very special place, having just celebrated his 21st year uh, being a formerly incarcerated person and having the unique position of being a formerly incarcerated, probably the only formerly incarcerated person I know who works for a law enforcement agency. He is the executive director of community engagement at the Genesee County, Michigan Sheriff's Office. He's also works with the National Sheriff's Organization. At the heart of his mission is a program called Ignite, which he has launched with his sheriff. It's an innovative inmate rehabilitation program that accomplishes something that's near and dear to my heart, breaking the cycle of generational incarceration by providing returning residents with a real live opportunity for a second chance. Percy has degrees from Mott Community College, as well as a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Michigan Flint, and a Master of Science Administration and Leadership from Central Michigan University. Percy, floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for having me. This is awesome. Piggybacking off the introduction, one of the things I spearhead here at the Genesee County Sheriff's Office in the Genesee County Jail is jail voting that started a little bit more than 5 years ago. Just to give you some context to the historical place where we began, Ashley Carter, who was then with the Advancement Project, reached out to me and said, "Hey, Percy, we would like to do, well, let me say this different. We see Genesee County Jail as an ideal fit for jail voting. Honestly, at that time, I did not even realize that a person in Michigan who has not been sentenced could vote from jail. Ashley then reached out to our then county clerk, John Gleason. He then reached out to the jail administrator at that time, Captain Jason Gould, and Clerk Gleason, Captain Gould, Johnny Allen Bay, myself, and Ashley Carter. We did a voter registration drive in the jail when we had about 375 people registered to vote. Moving forward, Janelle said, "Percy, we have a responsibility to continue this." I had absolutely no idea what that looked like. It was then on me to do all of the research, all of the reading, calling the Bureau of Elections, calling the Secretary of State, understanding what this needs to look like. And moving forward, this upcoming November general election will mark the 17th straight election where we supported jail voting over the last 5.5 years. When we started, there was very little activity around jail voting in Michigan. Our friends at Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office started, but it kind of fell off for reasons I'm not sure. Across the country, it really wasn't happening anywhere. Our friends in Chicago, Chicago Votes, does a great job at Cook County Jail. There's now some activity in Houston that's going very well. There's also new changes in laws where we'll see more things happening around electoral processes in Colorado, but that's still only a small section of the country. In Michigan, we have about 5 jails in Michigan that has some level of activity. Genesee County, what I spearhead here, is the most consistent. But I'll tell people that for someone that is in jail who has no previous convictions, who has no previous history with the law, who is there for pretrial services and has not been convicted and not sentenced, even in those states as a convicted felon, you should still be able to vote in jail because I have no previous past history. I am still not found guilty while I'm here in jail going through the judicial prosecutorial process. So in all reality, people should be able to vote in that regard in any jail across the country. In Michigan, legislation is if you are sitting in jail, pretrial services, if you are convicted and non-sentenced, you can vote in a jail in Michigan. And when we look at the numbers in Michigan, we're talking about anywhere from about 12 to 15,000 people in jails across Michigan that are potentially disenfranchised as voters. If we look at the across the country, we're talking about millions of people who don't have access to a ballot, which again, even those states as a convicted felon, if I'm sitting in that jail in that state where as a convicted felon, I cannot vote. If I'm a non-convicted person in any capacity in the jail in that state, I still should be able to access the ballot as a person resting in jail for pretrial services. This has been, over the last few years, a very interesting and very interesting moments of growth for us all. So in the upcoming weeks, I've organized a Meet the Candidate Forum. This will be our 11th Meet the Candidate Forum. And it really just came from, I had an epiphany one night. I said, okay, what's next? How can I challenge the status quo differently that brings attention the right way? And I said, well, part of the limitations for people in jails with voting is they lack access. They don't have the same access to social media, the news, or the ability to pick up the phone and call friends and say, hey, what do you think about this candidate? So I said to myself, why not just bring the candidate into the jail? Why not just bring the candidates into the jail? So I have an upcoming Meet the Judicial Candidate Forum October 3rd here at the Genesee County Jail at 2 o'clock. I've invited campaigners who are campaigning for Michigan Supreme Court, Michigan Court of Appeals, and 2 candidates who are campaigning for a local judicial seat. Of the 10 invitees, I have 5 who have confirmed. I expect 2 more of the 10 to confirm. 1 person has not responded back to my calls and emails, and 2 people said they 100% can't be here. And not only do things like this need to happen more consistently in jails, they also need to happen more consistently in the community. One of the barriers for people and why, among many reasons why they don't vote, is because they do not understand who or what they are voting for. So many times people go to the polls and see a name for the very first time. And that's not always a knock towards the candidate, but sometimes it is, because sometimes we don't have candidates who take the accountability to get out to the community broadly to let the community know them. But then also, when you look at other aspects of why people don't vote, economics play a huge part into it. If I am financially struggling, at the end of the day, I have issues with paying my rent, feeding my children, transportation. How motivated will I be to look at an electoral process when all of these other things are unhealthy for me in life? So there's just aspects of the electoral process that as advocates, we could be on the front side of, whether is voter economics, and we are looking at how can we transport people to the polls, whether it's education and getting all of the right, correct information about legislation, proposals, as well as the candidates to our community members or whatever it is. There's so many aspects and advocates that we can just be in front of. Also, when we look at the misconceptions, a great deal of people assume that if I'm in jail, I will vote out of boredom. Total opposite. The same mistrust and distrust community members have for the process is the same mistrust and distrust people have in jails. That is most times heightened because it's well documented that incarceration does something emotionally, mentally, behaviorally, in the most negative way to people. So their paranoia for the system is even more intense than community. So it's really important to engage and actively educate people in jails about, again, who and what is on the ballot and helping them understand the process. Also, most jails, for myself, when you look at judicial candidates, when you look at seats like Michigan Supreme Court Justice, Michigan Court of Appeals, my struggles and issues that sent me to prison are far removed from the life I live today. A Court of Appeals judge, a Supreme Court justice has no real bearing on my livelihood today because I'm, again, removed from anything negative from a prosecutorial process or a judicial process. But somebody in jail going through the court process has the most invested interest. Who becomes a judge locally? Who becomes a Supreme Court justice? Who becomes a Court of Appeals judge? They have the most invested interest because they are going through the judicial and prosecutorial process, along with people in jails have an even more invested interest in who becomes a county commissioner, who becomes the county sheriff, who becomes the county prosecutor. There are just multiple seats in multiple areas of government that people in jails, as well as prisons, but I know we're only talking about jails, that should be paying attention who is becoming their elected officials. The same way that for communities in the same capacity, an elected official works for the community. Without our vote, they do not receive the job. It is the same for someone residing in a jail. That inside jail community is also the employer for our elected officials. If they aren't connecting to the residents of jail in jails across Michigan or across anywhere where people can vote from jail, they are not playing their responsibility as an elected official. And we have to hold people accountable. We have to hold them accountable and help them understand. And I tell people all the time, if you voted from someone and you reach out with an email or phone call and you never get a response, you may need to reconsider why you voted for that person. Which, in all fairness, we're busy, but each office, each elected official should have a process in place where someone from that office is reaching back to the community. It's only appropriate, it's only fair. And again, as community, outside community members, inside community members, we are the employers for our elected officials. And we should be playing a heavy part in that hiring process as they campaign, as we understand that they have the community's best interest, whether that's the outside community or whether that's the inside community in jail, and as well as educate people. The unfortunate matter is there are so many people, even in the state of Michigan, that still don't realize people in jail can vote. There are so many people, and I'm speaking when I say people, I'm talking about elected officials, that don't understand that people in jails across the country can vote. To address a bigger elephant in the room. Also, the misconception is that a jail vote is consistent with a particular party. It's not about party affiliation. It's about providing access for all people that is a constitutional right. And that misconception that a jail vote is specific to a particular party is so untrue. If I walk into a jail and I am blue, I'm blue when I'm in the jail, and I still vote blue. If I walk into a jail and I'm red, I vote red, and I still vote red while I'm in the jail. So that is also a very huge misconception that people believe. I'll just say, be forthright, that people assume that a jail vote is a Democratic vote, which is not the case. So far from being true. Also want to drive home that the community also, on all topics, specifically jail voting, we have to help sometimes our elected officials be educated as well. Sometimes, and all the time, elected officials don't have all of the information. They don't understand all of the needs until we roll them out to them. Once they are rolled out to them, then it's the responsibility of the elected official. But we also, I'm saying that we all should be working hand in hand collectively to make our communities stronger economically, to make our communities safer, to make our communities clean, free from blight, trash. And that piece has also been a very vital piece that has been missing. And me being me, I really, 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 in the nicest way that I could say this, really encourage all of our elected officials to come work with our jail populations. Because at some point soon, they will be our neighbors again. And Mark, you and I talked at the beginning, right before this call, about my transition back to the community, how tumultuous that was. 20 plus years ago, a person leaving jail and prison had access to absolutely nothing. We want people who, for whatever reasons, which there's a small list that I can share about, but for whatever landed a person in jail or prison, we want to make sure they have the tools to stay out of that cycle. We want to make sure they are positive, responsible civilians as homeowners, as entrepreneurs, as business people, as employees, or as employers. We want them to have all the success because they will be our neighbors. And we want to see all of the elegant, happy, safe, responsible curb appeal and energy in our communities. When we look at how people end up in jail today, you have a category of people who are irresponsibly being criminalized because of alcoholism and drug addiction. Because I have a drinking problem or because I have a drug problem doesn't 100% make me a criminal. Sometimes it does, but most times it makes me, I have this illness I'm struggling with. You have a large number of people who are in jails and prisons today because of mental health issues. Because I'm struggling with my mental health doesn't 100% make me a criminal. Sometimes it does because of poor choices. But if we had certain systems in place for our mentally ill, or for our drug addicted, or for those struggling with alcohol, many times they won't land in jail and prison. And if you look at those two categories, a lot of that is also economic. You also have a category of young people that we also discussed right before the call, Mark, that we have a juvenile population that ends up in jail and prison because of poor upbringing, poor family structure, the irresponsibility of the encouragement of being with friends and the wrong crowd, their own internal impulsive immaturity, all these different factors. The whole school to jail to prison pipeline that needs to be examined. That also, if from a clinical standpoint, the brain doesn't mature emotionally, mentally, the right way until the age of 27, why are we holding 13, 14, 15 year olds to a standard of adults and sending them to jails and prisons? They're children. They should be nurtured responsibly when they make a mistake. Not saying the punishment, a punishment should be ignored, but we still have to understand that we are dealing with children. Another category of people you see more so in prisons today, not necessarily jails, the wrongfully convicted, primarily mostly Black and brown men, which is obviously racial, systemic, and economic. So when you look at, and then the last category is those people who fall into a bad place financially, whether I'm the mom and I was shoplifting to take care of my kids as a single mom, or whatever the case, economics play obviously a big part and factor in why people land in jail and prisons today. But all of those things can be better addressed if we have some preventative, if we have some pre-steps or pre-systems in place to derail all of those things. And I can continue to share, but Mark, is there any questions in the chat, any thoughts, any thinking from you or anybody else on the call that would like to ask or say anything?
I want to piggyback on some of the things that you said, Percy. But first, let me say I put it in the chat. But let me say it up front. If somebody has a question, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll take those up in just a couple of minutes. But I do want to piggyback on two things that Percy talked about. One of those is a little bit of a story of what's happened here in Chicago, down the block from us at Cook County Jail, where in Illinois, our good friends at Chicago Votes, who have been at the forefront of this fight in Illinois for quite a while, uh, got legislation passed that requires county clerks and county sheriffs to make voting booths, voting materials available to people in pretrial detention. Because of a quirk in that law, the individuals are registered at the jail. They're not registered at their former address. And so Cook County Jail has become the largest voting block in this ward of the city. And now, as a result of that, local candidates are recognizing that there are, 1,000, 1,300 votes sitting there as, every pun intended, a captive audience that they can get to, and a captive audience that is really thirsting for that kind of information. And we're seeing more and more that the very astute uh, uh, local candidates are going and campaigning at Cook County Jail without any prompting at all, because it's an easy place for them to get their message out. But that's the one thing I want to say. The other thing is that there's something I think we can all do, and it's to dispel this tremendous myth that is out there that if you have a felony conviction, you cannot vote. And I was a believer of that myth until it was dispelled from me. When I was getting out of prison 10 years ago, I thought that, well, that's it, my voting rights are gone. There are only 10 states in this country which put a lifetime ban or put an excessive ban on an individual's right to vote with a felony conviction. 15 states You lose your right to vote until you're released, and for some period after that. The growing trend is now in 23 states where you receive your right to vote. It's restored upon your release. In recent years, New York, California, Connecticut, Washington, Minnesota, and New Mexico have joined that trend. In Illinois, you receive your right to vote back when you leave incarceration, even if you're still on parole. So the minute you walk out that fence, even though you may still have 2 or 3 years to finish your parole, you immediately get that right to vote. DC, Maine, and Vermont, you never lose your right, even while you're incarcerated. Illinois tried to join that about 3 years ago, again with our friends at Chicago Votes, who came within one vote in the Illinois House of Representatives of getting a measure advanced that would allow people to have their voting rights continue while they're incarcerated. They're still moving past that. Um, I think it's incumbent on all of us, though, to get that word out. I can't tell you how often, both inside and outside of correctional facilities, I'll hear from people who saying, "Well, why are you talking to me about voting? I'm never going to be able to vote." Or folks on the outside saying, "Well, that person, they can't vote." And we need to get the word out there that that's not the case. For the simple reason that Percy brought up, there are, you know, as wonderful as groups like ours are, and others that are out there. Um, the number of people who are advocating on behalf of the incarcerated population and the returning resident population are pale in comparison to people who are advocating on behalf of other more financially motivated causes. As being a former lobbyist for the gaming industry and the energy industry, I can tell you that that the motivations and the abilities and the capacities of the folks that are lobbying in those areas far outstrip what's available for people who are on the other end of the spectrum and are more marginalized. The way we combat that is at the ballot box. We have a large and strong and opinionated population that we represent, that has some strong feelings based on their lived experience, strong, well-grounded feelings based on their lived experience, and we need to let them know that they need to get to the ballot box and elect people who are going to reflect those feelings. I'm going to throw one other thing out there real quick before we get to any questions we have and some final announcements from the staff. As much as we've moved forward on voting rights, and as I said, we see this trend where year after year after year, we're seeing more and more states move towards the restoration of an individual's voting rights upon their release or the completion of their sentence. We're not seeing, unfortunately, the same trend on restoration of an individual's ability to hold public office if they have a felony conviction. Very, very few states are allowing that to happen. Most states are going in the opposite direction, which is unfortunate. I'm hoping that the day will come where we'll see the same trend on allowing individuals to hold public office, because we need to have that reflected in our public offices. Surprisingly, while there are these restrictions at the state level, as we found out with the recent headlines as a result of former President Trump's felony conviction, there are no such restrictions at the federal level unless an individual has been involved in an insurrection or treason. So maybe this is something we need to start pushing, is to see how we can get some of our former incarcerated brothers and sisters elected at that level, and push down from the top. And with that, I will throw it open to any questions that anyone has. If they want to put it in the chat, please feel free, and we'll see if we can adjust them. Courtney has a question. Do jails automatically offer ballots or does an individual organization need to spearhead and organize at their local jail? In Illinois, I will tell you that the jails are required to offer ballots. But I think, in Percy, correct me if I'm wrong, you've been more at the forefront of this at the pretrial um, detention level than I have. Uh, what's your experience specifically in Michigan? What's your experience in across the country?
So in Michigan, current legislation doesn't force a sheriff to employ voting practices or processes. The sheriff has full autonomy to say, yes, we support a jail voting activity, or no, we don't. Now, because it's a constitutional right, no sheriff in my mind should openly say they're going to do something opposite of the Constitution, but there's nothing in place from a legal constitution place, legislative place that forces a sheriff to do anything. And that's kind of the same across the country. So that's when groups like Chicago Votes in Chicago reaches out, works with the sheriff, because again, the sheriff is also an elected official. If the sheriff is not working positively for the outside community as well as the inside community, there should be some discussions among voters that examine, is this the best sheriff for us that has the best interest of all people? And we see and we recognize the numbers that voting is part of that education that reduces recidivism. So as a sheriff who wants to see people stay out of jail, which all sheriffs want to see people stay out of jail, because that means the community is safer. That means there's less violence happening in the community. That means the community is not stretched so far and thin economically. So as a sheriff, I or she or me or we should want to see people not return to jail. But to answer your question more directly, like Michigan, sheriffs have a lot of autonomy on that. That's why we look at and can applaud Cal Giddings and that group over in Colorado who had legislation change. And while we look to build or develop legislation, we should also be contacting our sheriffs as grassroots orgs and community members to say, hey, how can we support? Unfortunately, the reality is sheriffs don't have an abundance of people knocking at their door for employment. They are not high on the list of people looking to say, hey, I want to work at a sheriff's office. Like most industries, sheriffs, law enforcement agencies are struggling to find people. So it makes even more sense to work with the jails, chaplains, volunteers, community organizations, grassroots orgs, top root orgs to empower voting in jails. I think I answered the question. I think I was just pretty long-winded.
Karen asked if we could post the list of states and the availability to vote with a felony. I have put that in the chat. It comes from a study that's been done by the National Council of State Legislators. Do either of you have civic engagement programs that you could recommend that ministers can use and share with people who are presently incarcerated? Um, I have taught Safer Foundations, um, Know Your Rights civic engagement program, which I believe is available on their website. I know Chicago Votes has extensive resources there. I believe the National Council of State Legislators has um, some resources on their website. Percy, you have
There are a
anything?
long list of Michigan and national partners. One great one is VAC, Voting Access for All Coalition. Another one is the Sentencing Project that has done a great
Yeah.
deal of top to bottom, side to side research on jail voting, Fair Voting Alliance. But also, if you could just send me an email at percy.glover@outlook.com, I could look and see and do some things that are specific to your state. But I would start with the Sentencing Project. They have a lot of intense data information on their website.
Percy, let me ask you this. When you go to state legislators and you want to sell this idea of either voting in prison or an automatic restoration of rights, you've mentioned, I know you've mentioned some of the arguments that it cuts down on recidivism, that it's not as blue oriented as people would think, and I can attest to that, having had and continue to have arguments with my brothers who I spent time in prison with. What are some of the other arguments that you raise with them as to why they should be doing this?
So it depends on the capacity of the argument. So we're talking about, say, for example, jails. So we're talking about people who have not, most times, especially after COVID, most people in jails are sitting much longer because of the backlog with our judicial and our prosecutors teams, our prosecutorial teams. So if you are a person in the jail who have not been convicted of anything, why should my constitutional right be lost and I'm not been convicted? Yes, I've been accused, but in all fairness, I'm not guilty until I'm guilty, found guilty. So that is number one. No one should lose something because of an accusation. If I was to accuse Mark of something, is it fair for him to lose everything across the board, even as a voter? I mean, again, one of the examples I've shared is that there are a great deal of people, and we see it in the news all the time, people who are being released from prison who were wrongfully convicted, which is a different conversation because we need to look at everything from the arrest, or excuse me, the investigation that leads to the arrest, that leads to the charges, leads to the prosecutor making a decision to charge. Because you look at the system and say, how do we have a person that spent 25, 30 years, and it took us 30 years or 25 years to figure out this person was not guilty? And we see this consistently over the last 5, 10 years. So first, I think we need to look at how we are arguing and exactly what we are. So we're talking about jails. So we're talking about non-convicted, non-sentenced people. They haven't lost anything. They haven't been found guilty. So I don't think anyone can make the argument that a person shouldn't be allowed access to a ballot as a non-convicted, non-sentenced person in jail. I don't think anybody has an argument for that. And I haven't heard anything from anyone. Also, it's a constitutional right as a non-guilty, non-sentenced person who is resting in the jail for pretrial services. That constitutional right has not been lost. And I have not heard an argument from anyone that said anything that makes sense or to rebuke that. So it really just depends on what we're arguing. If we're talking about people in prisons, the overarching goal for people in prisons is to habilitate them and to rehabilitate them. If education is a key component of that, why are we saying no when civic engagement is also a key component in reducing recidivism? The Michigan's budget, which has been this amount for a very long time, is 2.2 billion around corrections in Michigan. We could do a lot with that money if we could find a way to keep people out of jails and prison. And we can. Education. For me and others, a huge part of, and I mean, honestly, if I went back, I may do things differently, but a huge part to me staying out of prison, I went and got an associate's degree. I went and got a bachelor's degree. I went and got a master's degree. This helped me stay responsible to the transition in the community. It helped me stay responsible to my transition in the community. And we see not only with community members who have not had issues with the law, see how much more successful they are. That, and I can't remember these numbers, but person who gets an associate's degree makes 70,000 a year. Person who gets a bachelor's more makes 90,000 a year. Potentially a person that makes or earns a master earns six figures. So if we understand that education is a key piece to life success, why are we doing something to combat that for people in jails and prison? So again, I believe that it's what exactly we argue. Are we arguing people in jails as non-convicted, non-sentenced people? Are we arguing people on probation or parole? Are we arguing people in prisons? So like the argument would adjust depending on what exactly we're talking about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we look at the fact that 90% of people who go to prison are going to be released at some point, and they're coming home, and they're coming home to our communities. Don't we want them to be good citizens? Don't we want them to be
Absolutely.
educated
Absolutely.
citizens who want to participate in our democratic process, even more so than maybe some of our neighbors participate in our democratic process? And then to go a step farther, just to underline what you said, is it gives individuals that small sense of investment in themselves. And I truly believe that to the extent we continue to rise up that investment that an individual returning resident has in himself or herself, it creates the greater deterrence
Mm.
to recidivism. And if we can cut down on that revolving door, man, we're going to have so much more money to spend on so many other issues. Um, Anyone else have any questions before we turn this back over to the staff? Percy, any closing comments before we turn it over to staff?
No, I want to say thank you again. I really appreciate this moment. This is a very important topic that the layers of lack of systems for people in jails and obviously also prisons are the same layers that people struggle with not voting in the community. Whether they're talking about voter motivation, whether we talk about the lack or thereof of voter economics, voter currency, voter education, voter engagement, all of these key missing pieces that aren't empowered, employed in jails are the same missing pieces are in the community. So once we understand the connectivity of people in jails, people in prison, as well as people in community, we understand how we can empower everyone in the most effective way to become more active in the voting process. And again, thank you all for this opportunity.
And let me echo my thanks too to CPMC and Karen Courtney for putting this on, and again emphasizing that I think that the number one of the easiest things that we can all do is to dispel this myth that if you have a felony conviction, you're not going to be able to vote. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Thanks for joining us.